I had been renovating his quarters in the Brooklyn Temple. That was my job. And I did not go to the airport like everybody did, but I went to finish, because the mantle on the doorway between the hallway and his living room was not finished, and he could have tripped over it, so I was desperately trying to get the stupid thing to fit, and it was just not fitting. And because it was an old marble construction, I was having a very hard time doing this, and I had to cut the door to make the thing fit in there. So when I was so absorbed in this, I was just laying across it, trying to figure out how to get the thing in, and all of a sudden Prabhupada stepped over my head, and I didn't even know he had walked in, because it was completely silent, and he just stepped right over me. And as he stepped over me, I thought, oh my God, is it okay that I'm here? And he turned around and said, yes. So then I was like, woo, I didn't say that. So then I completed it very rapidly, and that was the first. When I first went to Vrindavan, it was, I think, October 1972. And what immediately struck me was how incredibly dirty everything was. I had just come from Bombay, where things were much better, relatively speaking, and Vrindavan was in very decrepit condition, open sewage, things were in disarray, there was litter in places, and I was quite discouraged by that. In fact, one of the first things I did was actually start sweeping the whole Radha Damodar temple. And so then Prabhupada, he said when we went on a walk, when I mentioned this, that it was very, very dirty, he said that because of the neglect that whatever the city commission was at that time, those responsible for it would have to take Bertha's hogs and dogs to learn their lesson and atone for not taking care of Vrindavan. The most significant feeling I had after hearing that was not so much thinking about the mayor, but rather to think about how Prabhupada was so determined to keep everything nice, and that he felt it was actually our duty and responsibility to do so, that he was very, when he said it, it was with emotion. So I understood how much he cared, and that was for me the most significant part. We, when we were young, had a lot of dedication to the projects we were doing, much more so than we had the dedication to be devotees and sadhus and things like that. So before Prabhupada came to Brooklyn in June of '71, all of us who were involved in building the press were working basically day and night with no break whatsoever, pouring concrete and mixing things and putting up shelves and getting things together, and ultimately bringing the press in there, the actual physical press in there, and all of the paraphernalia required for building the press. This was like a monster work. But that didn't last the whole time. So sometime 2-3 months before, or maybe 4 months before Prabhupada, or 3 months before Prabhupada came, the work of the press actually started, and the printing and pre-press work was going on full time. And Advaita, who was in charge of the press, was very dedicated to accomplishing these tasks. He completely set aside all other parts of life and just dedicated himself to accomplishing these tasks. And we felt he was a very dedicated person, so we didn't think about it. But when Prabhupada came, and the reason I know this, I was in his room during this conversation, he might have asked me, or he might have gotten a report about Advaita not chanting. Maybe Bhavananda was there and he might have said it, I don't really know. And so Prabhupada thought this was not good at all. And the lesson here, before we finish the story, was that he thought it was more important for his spiritual life that he chant and not just accomplish the tasks. The tasks were part of the work, but the chanting was like the main work. The consideration of your own personal spiritual life was the main work. So then I had to go and get him. So I went out and got him and brought him in. And he stood there in a very humble way. He wasn't exactly sure what was going to happen. I remember that. And then Prabhupada asked him about the rounds, and he said, well, Prabhupada, I thought you thought that this was the most important work there was. So me making the sacrifice didn't seem to be so important. I mean, for me to sacrifice myself for your books to be published and everything. And then Prabhupada told him, no, I'm here for you. The time is now for you to chant. And if you chant and you do the work, that is the perfect combination. I'm paraphrasing somewhat because I can't possibly remember the exact quote, but that was the gist of it. And I was quite impressed with that because I felt that, yes, this is not just a utilitarian act. It was difficult for us because we had been working like madmen for these months to get everything ready, and yet at the same time what was more important was the spiritual life, the spiritual basis upon which we did all of that. So that was a good lesson. I was part of a traveling Sankirtan party that was traveling all over India. Tamal Krishna Maharaj was in charge. There were 4 other swamis, and we drove jeeps, and we were going around doing programs in Bhopal and other places with the Birla temples. We were doing it in conjunction with the Birlas. So when we were leaving the Birla temple in Bhopal, we got word that there was a big problem in Bombay, that Matre, the magistrate there, tore down the temple. The ladies were being harassed by the man. It was a very serious incident. So we immediately drove straight to Bombay, but at the same time, he had caused the Indian government's agency, CID, I don't remember exactly what they're called, to come after us for our visas. Myself and Giriraj, we were there with visas that had expired. So our entire situation became very bad. So in order to try to recover or to fix what had happened to the temple, we moved to on Nepensi Road, apartment which was owned by a life member. And we stayed there, and we went around all over Bombay to get people to support the temple and to fix the temple and everything. Now this went on for quite some time, and the American embassy was trying to find me to get me out of India, Giriraj as well. At the same time, we were both sick. We had jaundice of various kinds and hepatitis of various kinds. And we still had to keep going. We had to keep on doing the work, go out and convince people to do this and that. So we were just stuck in the Nepensi Road, because if we went back to Juhu, we'd be arrested. Me and Giriraj, we would have been arrested on the spot. There was no way we could have done it. So we just stayed there. And Tamal Krishna Maharaj made his office there, and Gargamuni Swami was there too. Achyutananda Maharaj was there in the back. So we were basically camped out there. And things were getting very, very bad for us spiritually, because there were no deities, there were no programs, we were running from the police, we were having to go out and clandestinely visit members and go to their offices, and we were doing really a whole rah-rah campaign that all of these big people would work against the government to stop them. But that really paid, our consciousness paid a heavy price. It was a tough toll to pay we had to do. So when Prabhupada came, he hadn't come for quite some time. So when he finally came, he came to that flat, and I had arranged a Vyasa-san for him and everything. So he came in the door, and we were trying to pretend that everything was fine. And we knew we were pretending. The idea was to just make it as nice as possible for Prabhupada. He walked in, sat on the Vyasa-san, looked around, said, "Where are the deities?" well, we don't have any, Srila Prabhupada, because we don't do any worship. He said, do you do program? Well, we don't have any time because we're doing this undercover work and we're fighting for the lives of the temple and like that. And then he looked very disgusted because he understood immediately. You know, you can't cheat Prabhupada. He looks through things. So he immediately looked out at this ragtag group trying to pretend that we really had it together. And he understood we didn't have anything together and that we really needed the deities. So that's when he said that we have to shut this down. We can't do this anymore. We have to go back to Juhu and take up the project again. Now, for me and Giriraj, that was a little bit more difficult. Well, we did it anyway, but we had to live in the flats, not in the temple area, but in the flats next to the temple area. But we did it, and we all moved back, and it was very ecstatic. The real ecstasy that you might have been asking me about was, now I forgot his name, very nice man who helped us rebuild the temple. His company came in, and he brought all of his men to rebuild.
Seti?
Mr. Seti, thank you. Rebuild all the temple with all of his men. They were putting the blocks in and everything, and they were guarding against Matre's men who were coming. And while he was doing that, we were having ecstatic kirtans, just really rip-roaring ecstatic kirtans. And the workers were just going so quickly because we had one day basically to do it. So they were just building like mad, and we were kirtaning like mad, and it was just an uproarious, wonderful time. So yes, Prabhupada was again right, that this was a very good way to revive our consciousness during this incredibly difficult time. Our work for producing books for Prabhupada, for the BBT, well, for Prabhupada as the BBT, was, in our minds, the most important work we could possibly do. And so we had gone through all of this endeavor to finish all of his books, to catch up to him. That was the goal. The absolute goal was to catch up to Prabhupada so that he would say something, I would get a tape, transcribe it that morning, it would go immediately to whoever's doing the Sanskrit thing, and Zoom it would be off to LA, and we would have everything going very rapidly. Now, the problem was that in LA, Rameshwar and others were very enthusiastic, and they wanted Prabhupada to write more, which of course everybody did, so there was nothing wrong with that. However, I was on the other end of all these phone calls, you know, Vrindavan-style phone calls, kind of thing, and this is all at weird times of the day because of the time difference, and I'm left with the task of somehow getting this to happen. It's very easy to think of this happening, and it's quite difficult to make that actually happen because everything involved in it is out of your control. So I went to Prabhupada and I explained the dilemma we were having, that we want you to write more, you want more to write more so that we can produce more books. We all know this. We're all on the same side, the same page, but how can we possibly make that happen? I'm not going to force you to do that. You're not going to allow me to force you to do that. You're not going to care whether they say in Los Angeles. So how can we make this happen? So then we were discussing it, how we can make this happen. So he was suggesting somehow get him more time so that he didn't have to worry about things. So as far as I could, I took care of whatever political issues or whatever kind of other issues were there, and I tried to shuffle them off to GBCs so that he could do his work. Now, the real problem was that there was a lot of time of the day meeting people. He spent a lot of time. In Vrindavan, he was open basically all the time. So he had time in the morning to do his translating, but then there was this large part of the day where he was just talking with people all day long. So I suggested, I said, I know this is not usually what is done, but maybe just do it less or don't do it at all. Take a vacation and just work on books, or just do it less. And he said that that's very difficult because these people come here to see me. And this is my responsibility. This is my home. This is where I present. So this is my base, more or less. Not exactly quoting, but this is where I work from, and therefore my responsibility to speak to these people because they inquire, they want to know. So then I said, yeah, well, there's not much I can do about this now. So then I told that to them in LA. We tried to do what we could do. We did as best we can. Then Prabhupada called me in and he said, you should do the darshan. And I'm, me? Me? He said, yeah, you should sit there and you should receive the people who come and you should answer their questions and you should speak with them. And I said, okay. Not like I had all that much choice. So the next day, we did that. Prabhupada went, after his lunch, he went into his room and he started working on his books. And I positioned myself in his room, and there next to his asana there was this little cushion, so I sat there. And I'm waiting, looking very darshanable and ready to speak to anyone who would come. So one man came and he sat down and he was looking at me. And I didn't know what to do because he was looking. I was going to speak, I was going to do something. So I decided to say something. Other people came, looked in, said, where's Swami? I said, I'm assisting him in this way. They said, oh, and they walked away. So then after this dreadful period of time passed, Prabhupada walked in and he said, well, how did it go? I said, well, actually it went terrible. There was nobody, one guy, and I didn't say one person, it was, and the others walked away. They weren't interested in me. He said, that's the problem. They come here to see me. That's why I have to sit there. This is my responsibility. And so I never said it again. We shut down the entire operation of trying to get him to write more. We shut down all these activities to try to free him to write more. We just accepted the situation. In continuation of the idea of Prabhupada should write more, previous to this, I came to realize that Prabhupada's act of writing was very deep and very significantly considered. Every single word he put was not whimsical in any way. It wasn't like I'm talking now. It was very different than what you might have assumed when he wrote. Now I know in some of the Krishna book tapes that are out, there's a lot more flowing, because Prabhupada was, I think in that sense, telling a story that was from the verses. It was a story and he would give commentary on it. But it was very much in a story-like mood. Whereas in the Bhagavatam, or whichever book he was doing, it was quite different because he was teaching at the same time. And he was considering this book to be very, very significant and important. So I found very early on, when transcribing Prabhupada, to understand this better, it's important to know what it means to transcribe. It's not that you just simply hear some words and you start typing with your fingers, because only some of it was in English. A lot of it was in Bengali or Sanskrit. And to hear, you're hearing now. Let's say you've never heard a verse before, and you hear it in Sanskrit, and you've got to put it on the paper. Now, I don't know if people ever thought about that, but that's like a big job. And so Prabhupada had many books. One of the books he might have been using for the actual verses, and that might have had purports in it. They all had purports in it. Some of the books he used were from the Gaudiya Math, from Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada's translations and commentaries. Other was from Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, and then there was a big book that had 8 acharyas' commentaries in. Now, this was a big thing. Each canto was big, thick. So he would when he would be speaking, you had to not only hear what he said in English, but you had to hear it in Sanskrit or Bengali, and you had to know where it came from so you could properly transcribe it, because you never heard these verses before either. So when I first started, the first thing I had to face when transcribing, before I even got to the Sanskrit Bengali difficulty, obstacle, which was sometimes huge, was that Prabhupada was using these Ewer dictaphones. And they had a remote, kind of like remote, or a hand piece where you would push it and the microphone was in that hand piece. So you have not only the button, but you have the movement of a analog microphone, which was very sensitive to motion and stuff like this. It was a really good one, but still. So every time Prabhupada clicked the button, in actuality, the recording would start some half second after the button get pushed, and it would stop as soon as you release the button. So he had a rhythm which he used for his coordination between his finger and his mouth. And this rhythm was such that he no longer thought about the device in his hand. It was just a given. And he was simply thinking about what it was he was going to say. But the effect was that you would end up with like this. If you're going to say, for example, Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, you would get Krishna is the Supreme Personality of God, or something like that. And now let's go on to another part, that sometimes he would only say one word. I once sat, many times, not just once, outside his door as he was writing, dictating. I would just sit there and listen in the middle of the night. And because I loved it, because I was intimate with the act of creation in as much as I got the first tape and I had to type it. So I would listen. And then I would hear him speak. And once it went on for like minutes. And I'm like, wow, what happened? And I was stunned that the amount of time between these words was sometimes very long. So when he would say "and," for example, all you would really hear with the click on, click off is "dip." Sometimes I would hear "ja," "it," "di," "ah," "oh," and there were different sounds. It wasn't just "and," it was a pile of different words. And he would take so long to think of that particular word because he wanted to get it precise. Because he didn't go back over it. This was his one chance to do it right. And he took great pride in what he wrote. This was his life's work. So he took great pride in it, as anyone would, but especially him, he took great pride in it, so he wanted to say it perfectly. But the problem was that the word that he took 5 seconds to think of sounded to me, who's supposed to transcribe it. So what I did was, I very carefully would examine the context of the sentence once I actually pieced it together, because sometimes that happened 3 or 4 times in a sentence, and I would learn what those fragments were. I would learn what word those fragments were. And when I was very confident I had it good, I went to Prabhupada and I said, I'm going to read you this sentence. You tell me what you think. I didn't tell him why. I said, blah, 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 blah. He said, yes. So? I said, no, fine. So I actually got it what those little fragments were. Very difficult. And sometimes they weren't, I couldn't get it perfect because I don't know whether it was right or wrong. I thought it was. And so then you would hit this Sanskrit. Now, sometimes of these 10 different purports you could refer to, one in one book, one in another book, and the 8 in the other. And I also knew what book he had on his desk because I put it there. So if it was, for example, Chaitanya Charitamrita, where he was just using the Gaudiya Math version, piece of cake, because I knew where to find the quotes in the purports. Very easy. But if he had multiple books, which was most of the time, so what you have to do is hear it, memorize what he's saying, and then look to find that pattern in all of the Sanskrit and Bengali for 8 different acharyas for this one verse. And sometimes, especially like Sanatana Goswami, he sometimes had 10 pages of commentary. I mean, Sanskrit pages, 10. Thick, black, 10. Not all the time. Some were like paragraphs, but so it would take long time to figure it out. And sometimes it wasn't there. It wasn't in any of the books. So then I gave up. Then I said, I can't handle this. So I go to Prabhupada. I said, you said this. Where is that from? And he would say, that's from over there. And I would go, run back there, find it. Yep, there it is. Now, that's phenomenal. I'd like to also talk about other people who had spoken about Prabhupada's Sanskrit capacities and stuff, but that's phenomenal. That he knew where he got that from. And these were not those usual quotes that everybody knows nowadays. And these are very esoteric. Some of them are quite esoteric. Of course, yeah, after a while, everybody knows all of them because they're knowing what was at that time. Never heard that before. So he knew where they were. And he helped. But once, he didn't know it either. It took me 1 week. That's what I had mentioned before. 1 week to find that quote. Because if you don't have it, you can't type it. And if you don't know where it is, the Sanskrit people can't double check your transliteration. Because when you transcribe, you also have to do transliterations. Because they don't want to do it. They're doing other stuff. So I had to find it, properly transliterate it, and then they would put the diacritic marks because I didn't have time for all that junk. I mean, it was phenomenal, the process of writing these books. I mean, for me, when I said on the beach that your books are just getting better all the time, and he said, do you think so? I said, it's amazing, because I was the one typing them, and I saw it happening in my eyes, saw it right in front of me that it was getting better and better and better. I was just amazed. He was very happy. For him, that was the greatest compliment, not these other things which people generally said, oh, you're so wonderful, blah, blah, blah. I said, these are getting better and better all the time. He was just like beaming because that was his life's work. And I remember when we were doing the universe thing, and that was a whole nother story, but related to Sanskrit, somebody brought up this Sanskrit scholar from Udupi. He was really a big-time Sanskrit scholar. So he was giving his ideas of what the 5th canto verses were supposed to mean. And he was talking about some Sanskrit thing. And then Prabhupada said, very humbly, he said, oh, actually, I thought it meant this. And that man was stunned. He just shut up immediately, stunned. He couldn't say a word. He just looked down. He was like, it's like all of a sudden something blew up in his head that, oh my God, that's right. So then from that point on, whenever somebody would say something about Prabhupada's scholarship, I said that, yes, but in the real world of interaction and scholarship, many times these scholars found that they didn't know as much. And I found that to be very significant. I had just finished the sannyasa initiation in Mayapur that Prabhupada did for me. After we did some kirtan and the fire ceremony, he went upstairs and was getting his massage. And he asked me to come up after that was done, after the ceremony was done, while he was getting his massage. And then he looked at me and he took out an arrow, put it on a bow, and said, "Be careful of Cupid's arrow. Everybody is influenced by Cupid's arrow. You have to preach." One of the many cooking difficulties I had, this one was rather unique in its own way, was I had to constantly cook in a totally new environment each place we went to. Now in the Paris temple in that day, in that time, I think it was on Rue de Sur, it was very small. Not small in a small, it was a couple of story building, but it was very skinny because it was on a corner. So the kitchen itself was very skinny. And there was counters on both sides with everything was on a very skinny thing. So barely you had enough room for two people to fit in there, which is very French, especially in those days before they really developed the country. So I had to go in there, and I needed help. I didn't know where anything was. I needed these things I bought. Somebody had to go speak French or go buy things and everything. So this girl was designated as the one to help me. So while I was trying to get things together in the kitchen, and I didn't want to be distracted in any way because it's really hard. You have a very short period of time during the massage to get the lunch together. The lunch has to be exactly warm at exactly the moment when he finishes his shower, sits down and puts his tilak on, and then the plate hits. So this is like clockwork. You got to get it, you got to time it, you got to know exactly what's happening. So there was this girl who, I don't know, I'm not going to say anything bad about this girl. I don't remember who she was, and if she ever hears this, I'm sorry. But the point being that, well, she was in the same kitchen as me for some reason all the time, for some deity offering, I don't know what. So constantly I was getting rubbed into, across the back or wherever, and it really bothered me. And I was trying to be a good brahmachari. I was trying to be, I was cooking for Prabhupada. I didn't want this kind of thought in my head at all. And so this happened way too many times. Whatever, I don't remember how many times it was way too many times. I said, that's it. So I stomp out of the kitchen, and I stomp into Prabhupada's room where he's getting a massage. I said, "Prabhupada, I cannot cook in this place." I said, "This girl in the kitchen, she's just in the way all the time, constantly distracting me, completely pushing up against me. I said, I cannot, I'm a brahmachari, I can't do this anymore." So then he says, "So I shall not eat." And I was trying to make an excuse. Well, that's not exactly what I meant. I meant maybe some lady can cook or she could cook. But he says, "No, I shall not eat. You are my cook. I want you to cook. I shall not eat." And then I felt terrible. And then he said, "There are girls everywhere, women everywhere in the world. If you avoid them like this all the time, you will have nowhere to go. What will you do?" So I understood that lesson very well. It was a very important lesson that sometimes you have to do what's important, and you just have to bite the bullet, so to speak, or do whatever's required to get it done. So I went in there and I begged her to just please not do that, and otherwise we'll be okay. And I just concentrated on it and brought it in. And I don't remember what he said afterwards, but I think he was smiling somehow because he was eating. We had been doing programs all around South India. Actually, our job as part of the program crew was to eat 3 times a day. And the people would come out with these incredible feasts. In South India, this was, you couldn't possibly understand how good the food was. So at one of these luncheons, a group of local brahmanas, and I even think they were part of a samaj of some kind or an organization of some kind. It seems that they were invited by the person who invited us to lunch, and it seems that this was to some extent a setup, not something that was ordinarily to be expected. It was something that there seemed to have been some organization to this. So when we finished eating, Prabhupada went into the back room. There was a table there, some chairs and things, and there was a porch, because it was in a house where they had a porch around. So I was on the porch, and then all of a sudden from inside the house, about 4 or 5 of these brahmanas came in. And so I stood there at the door because, I felt bad, something's wrong. And I was pretty strong in those days, so I didn't think I would have any problem with these people. So they started talking to Prabhupada in a they were not polite. They were upset that he was ruining Hinduism. He was ruining the Brahminical name. He was ruining it for Brahmanas by making Malechas and Yavanas Brahmanas. He was destroying the culture. He was ruining everything. And they were very angry. They were very upset. So I had enough. I just threw open the door. Prabhupada held up his hand and went, and I just, literally, I was ready to tear into them. And I just stood there. And they went on, and they went on, and on about how bad he was, and how much he ruined everything, and how much, and he just sat there. Didn't say a word. And they went on and on and on. And then he just looked down in a very humble way. You could sense that. It was a very humble way. He was just looking down. And they were becoming less and less boisterous. They were becoming less and less forceful. And you could see their energy was just dissipating until finally they had nothing left to say. And they just got up and walked out. And that could have gone way south, way fast. But Prabhupada just sat there and with just intense humility displayed to them with such power that they're supposed to be the brahmanas and he's supposed to be the one ruining everything. And they're speaking with such anger and hatred, and he's just sitting there. And when they realized the irony of that, they realized they defeated themselves and they walked out the door. And for me, that was just spectacular. And I told him so. I said, I was ready to, I confessed, I said, I was ready to come in and start pounding heads. And he said, I know. And I said, that was very good what you did. That was very good. I had to cook in some really horrible situations. Places where there was no kitchen, or places where there was just a shelf and you had a hot plate, electric hot plate, and that was the kitchen, or with a bowl of water. Mauritius was one of those places where, and the flour that was given to me was, you could have just made sawdust and had the same effect with this flour. It was so bad. In Mauritius, the food at that time was so awful. And the flour they gave me to make chapatis was so terrible. But this had been going on all through Africa. All over Africa, Nairobi, and well, we hadn't gotten down to South Africa yet. So it was a serious problem, all of these places. It was also a problem in India before. Some of the kitchens were terrible, and we weren't staying in temples all the time. So I had to make chapatis. Now, I'm not Sruti Kirti. Sruti Kirti is the chapati acharya. Anything chapati he makes, it's perfect. Me, I struggle to make chapatis. Sometimes I could make them not bad. If it was a good flour, if it was a gas stove, and if it was all the conditions were what they usually are in any temple in the world, I can make a chapati. Not as good as him, but I still could make a chapati. It was acceptable. Now we're in these conditions, which are in battlefield conditions, basically speaking. So Mauritius, the worst possible thing, because we're in some outpost house in the middle of nowhere, and it's just a hot plate. Just one hot plate. That's not even so hot. Flour, that's so bad. You can't do anything with it. And I'm struggling just to make a dough. I'm struggling to make this chapati. And it came out to be like I'm giving Prabhupada pieces of cardboard. Literal. Didn't blow up nothing. It was just cardboard. And so this continued as we went through these horrible places. I couldn't get good flour. I couldn't get a stove. I couldn't get anything. So he was getting very upset because the Sruti Kirti said just this afternoon, he said, for Prabhupada, food meant a good chapati. If you could do a good chapati, everything else was forgiven. If you couldn't do a good... Anyway, so I couldn't get chapatis together. So we finally make it back to Bombay. And I was struggling in Bombay because the stove was... There was no gas pressure. There was no real kitchen there. It was, again, horrible. So I made better chapatis because the dough, the flour was good. I made better chapatis, but they weren't really up to the standard. So then Prabhupada looked at them and he said, but what he had been saying all along, each time, was big brain can't even make a chapati. This was his standard statement. So I bring the chapatis in Bombay. Big brain can't even make a chapati. So then I said, Prabhupada, nobody can make a chapati on these stoves. I was talking about the ones all over. I said, nobody. I don't care who they are. I didn't say Sruti Kirti, because maybe he could. I don't know. I don't care who they are. Nobody can make chapati on these stoves. He said, nobody? He's sitting at his table. Nobody? I said, nobody. He said, nobody? Then he pushes his hands up, gets up off the table, walks into the kitchen. And I'm like, whoa. Then he says, where's the dough? And I'm sitting behind him. We're both on the floor. I'm behind him. He's sitting there in front of the stove. And he's going like this, looking at me. Then he was very good at rolling chapatis. Perfect. Looks at me. Puts it on the drying thing there that you make chapati with. He's looking at me. Takes it off. Puts it on the stove. It doesn't blow up. I smirked. I'm this far away from him, right? So he heard me smirk. I don't know if I can duplicate it exactly, but it was something like, Yeah. So then he turns around and looks at me, gets the dough, does it even faster, chucks it on the plate, throws it on the grill. It blows up. He picks it up with the tongs and throws it at my nose. And it bounces off my nose. And he stands up triumphant and walks out of the kitchen. And I'm sitting there hysterically laughing. It was the greatest thing that ever happened. It was just spectacular. Getting chapati bouncing off your nose. We were having a feast up on that second floor in Juhu where Prabhupada stayed. I don't exactly remember why we were having that feast. It was some festival day. And so I had helped with cooking for Prabhupada and for doing some of the preparations, and I helped serve out in that living room area, which is outside his room, the people who were there. And so Prabhupada was eating, and he said I should eat. So I was eating at the doorway between the two so I could keep an eye on what's going on. And so I was eating, and then he told me to come over and told me to give him more of some preparation. I said, okay, let me go wash my hands. He said, no, just do this. Give me it now, because a Vaishnava hand is never contaminated. I said, for sure, now I'm going to go wash my hands. And then I did. And then when I came back and I served him, he didn't say anything about it. Because I took this in two ways. Well, the first way was that he said, well, a Vaishnava's hand is never contaminated, the obvious way. And I said, well, I'm not in that category of Vaishnava that I can get away with that, so I'm going to go wash my hands. And then the second way was, which was more difficult to deal with, well, he said, look, basically, I'm hungry, I want it now. And it doesn't matter if your hands are clean or dirty. It's kind of like Krishna with the gopis with the dust for Krishna's headache. So it was a difficult situation. But the only reason I did it that way, because I knew I could run quickly to the sink, which was only like 10 feet away, and then run quickly back. But I liked many times the way he did that kind of a... He took a requirement, something he wanted, and turned it into something much bigger in a very subtle way. It was a very big thing in a very small package. That's how I felt. As I've consistently said, I never met anybody more intelligent. And for me, that was very important because I was able to have conversations with him which were really a lot of fun. They were far-reaching. I mean, we had conversations where everybody else was like, what are they talking about? And I like that. Not because I'm an elitist in that way, but I mean to say, maybe I am. Okay, but that's not the point. The point is he's very smart and very intelligent. And I still think the most intelligent person I ever met. So I don't see him exactly in the same sentimental way. When you use the endearing term, that it should be endearing, well, I'm not exactly sure that's, for me, the most important thing. For me, what I saw was somebody who was very, very intelligent and who had enormous capacity because of that, which was of great significance to the world and specifically to me. And as far as I was concerned, well, usually one thinks only about oneself when one thinks about these things. So that was, for me, the most significant quality, his deep intelligence. And he was very fast. I mean, that's part of it, that you can say something to him, and within a very short period of time, you'll get a very amazing answer, which may be like a few steps ahead. And then if I were to think about that for quite some time and then respond, you know, so now we're all up there, he would respond to me a few steps ahead, just hearing what I said immediately. So that's a very rare, for me, that's very rare to see. And so that really impressed me the most.
Je anilo